I want to start a series, and today is an introduction. So it's broader than the following weeks, which will dig deeper into various biblical topics. And I've called this When God Does a New Thing Again, and I'll make reference to the little canoeing in the mountains a little bit later on. But I want to tell you a story to start with, which is it's a historical story. I think John said a couple of weeks ago, he said, not really into history. Suck it up and try and learn something this time. There is a point to it, even if the rest of history is a bit pointless. So I want to tell you a story. It's not even Australian history, which kills me. But it's a story that the guy who wrote the book Canoeing in the Mountains takes and says, we can learn something about God from this historical story. Now we know that Jesus did that time and time again. He talked about shepherds, and he talked about farmers, and he talked about kings, and he talked about mountains, and he talked about building processes and armies. He kept going, you can learn something about God by looking at what you know about. So let's see if we can't do that today. So what I want to talk about today is what is called the Lewis and Clark expedition, which happened in the United States, and it happened fairly early in the 1800s, like 1803. So it's a while ago, and they were two explorers that I'll talk a little bit about. Now, the first thing we need to know for this to make sense is that around about that time, if you wanted to transport something heavy, the water, the river, the oceans, the bays were the best way to do that. So they became the heavy transport links, much more efficient than bullock drays in Australia or mule trains. In fact, and what we've got here is at the Gulf of Mexico is the Mississippi River that goes up to where it forks, and then the Missouri River is this one that wraps round to the left. That is something like the two of those rivers combined were over 6,000 kilometres long. And they would put boats on, and you could probably remember this, the big paddle wheelers. Long before that, they had boats that would go up and down the rivers. The same in England, there are all canals and locks and all this kind of stuff for transporting. Right through Europe, the same thing. If you wanted to move goods or get around, it was easier to build a boat than a highway. Does that make sense? It's changed now. It's changed now. But so the Missouri and Mississippi rivers was this massive waterway that kind of supplied, well, the heartland of what we know as the United States. You did recognise that as the United States, did you? That's good. Because if you went to the time we're talking about, that wasn't the United States. The only part of what we just saw is this little yellow bit over here. That was the United States in 1800. The big pink bit is called the Louisiana Purchase. And for the history buffs, the United States bought that. So they more than doubled the size of the United States. For about $15 million, they bought it. Anyone know who they bought it from? France. Napoleon Bonaparte. He had bought it from the Spanish and couldn't pay it. So it was like, I got this one ordered and they didn't pick it up, I'll give it to you special. You've heard those kind of things before. And so they bought the Louisiana Purchase, and it took up all the states, much more than the state of Louisiana. And all of a sudden they had this massive area of previously pretty much unexplored area of land with a major waterway running through it. And Thomas Jefferson said, we need to find out that when you get to the top of the Missouri, everyone believes, it was common knowledge, that there'd be another river and you could work your way down. And if we could find the river that went to the Pacific Ocean, we would have this like mega highway, and that'd be so great. And we now own the land, so we can be the trading partners. And so they set up what was called the Corps of Discovery. They got these two guys, previously army guys, and they said, this is what we want you to find out. We want you to find a navigable waterway to the Pacific Ocean. So we want to be able to sail up the Mississippi, up the Missouri, get to the top of that, jump off, get on another boat and go down to the Pacific Ocean. They said, as you do that, we want you to establish trading agreements with the Indian nations, because all of our images of Indians and cowboys and Indians and stuff, that pretty much came from this area. All those incredible nations were there. They wanted to establish US authority because the Spanish, the French, the Canadians, the Americans, the English, all had an oar in the water because no one owned this before, really. And so they said, we own it, we're going to become the dominant trading partner. So we want you to just let them know who owns this place now. And then finally they said, and anything you can find, if there's new birds, bugs, stuff like that, we want you to write it down. And so Lewis and Clark started out on this, going up river with two 40-foot long canoes. Now, a 40-foot long canoe was about at least from where I am to where Justin's sitting. That's a big canoe, isn't it? They had a boat called a keel boat that was 66 feet long and 8 feet wide. It could carry 12 tonne of equipment because 22 men would get on the oars and row. So that was a fairly significant boat, wasn't it? They actually had a frame of a steel boat that was kind of a collapsible. And they had that all packed up for when they couldn't get any further up the river in the keel boat, they would have the two canoes and some others. So they battled against a 5-knot current for a year. 50 men went up the river. In one place, they had to get them around a set of waterfalls, and it took them 3 months. They sent the big boat back down, and the smaller boats, they said, it's too hard now. It took them 3 months just to carry from the bottom of the waterfall to the top of the waterfall all their equipment. An amazing thing. About 50 men did it. One person died in the 2 years that it took to do this journey. That's amazing in itself. And so they have gotten, and the river gets tighter and tighter and harder and harder. And after about a bit more than a year, they said that one of the guys stood with 1 foot on each side of the Missouri River because it was only this wide. About 2 or 3 days later, they got beyond the source of the Missouri River, and they're geared up. They're up there with these amazing canoes, and they get there and they get to a place called Lemhi Pass. And Lemhi Pass is the end of the Missouri, and they're ready to see this new river that they can launch onto. The only problem was, actually, if you took that lake out, because I couldn't find a picture without a lake, there was no water. What there was 300 miles of the Rocky Mountains. And, you know, a few rapids and stuff like that, but no great river, no great lake, no inland sea like they thought was in Australia. But everybody believed it must be there. The French believed it, the Spanish, the English and the Americans, everybody believed that there would be another major river down to the west coast. And as they stood there, they realised life in the future wasn't going to be the same as life in the past. Let me read a quote from that book, Canoeing in the Mountains. That's where he gets his title. He said, what Lewis actually discovered was that 300 years of experts had all been wrong. In front of him was not a gentle slope down to the Pacific Ocean, but the Rocky Mountains stretching out for miles and miles and miles as far as the eyes could see. Was one set of peaks after another. They were there after more than a year's travel with 40-foot long canoes, and at this point they had to rethink the way ahead. They had to abandon the canoes that they had fought so hard to take up and buy horses. And I figure they probably had to learn how to ride as well. And Todd Bolsinger, who wrote that, he said, this is a brilliant analogy of what we're finding in the church today. And he's a consultant for the churches. He said, because he said, we have thought, in their case, that the West Coast would be a replica of the East Coast, that it was fairly gentle slope with major rivers, and it wasn't. It was Rocky Mountains, and the rivers that were there went through rapids and waterfalls time and time again. It was completely different. They arrived at the Rocky Mountains with canoes, and they had to rethink. And Bolsinger said, for most of the church, we have expected that the future will be a replica of the past. And he said that he's ministering and working with people for whom the reality that everything I've known in my lifetime, the way we used to do church, it's a different landscape. It's like having canoes at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. And it doesn't mean it hasn't been worthwhile, it hasn't been valuable, it has been exactly what God needed to do in the past. But I want to ask the question that Bolsinger asks. What happens if the way forward from here is radically different from what has gone before us? I had the opportunity to go over to Western Australia many years ago, and at East Fremantle, I was working with the church doing an evangelism, looking at ways they could reach out into their community. One older lady, she just got frustrated. She said, I don't understand all this new stuff. She said, back in the old days, we used to put a big sign out the front that said everybody was welcome to church and we prayed. And it worked. And she was dead set that we had left all the good stuff and we were getting into newfangled stuff. And my heart went out to them. I'm kind of going, I would love to live in an era where all you had to do was put a sign out the front and pray. But I knew that there were plenty of places with fantastic signs and fantastic prayer groups that were still not seeing people saved. And it was different. One of my predecessors working for the Baptist Association, he used to say, most Baptist churches are praying that next year will be 1955. Because we know how to do 1955. I'm not as cruel as him. I think that most Baptist churches like to, we're really geared up for about 1975. We kind of think if we can find a better youth program, that'll grow the church. Now that we've got kind of videos rather than flannel graph of my day to tell stories, surely that will do it. If we prayed harder, if we gave more, it was almost if we put in more effort into what used to work. Maybe if we got those canoes, and yes, I know it's an uphill slope into the Rocky Mountains, but if we paddle really hard, we know how to paddle, it's never going to work. And I think that there's some great stuff to learn. They were in a unique spot because they had to leave their canoes because the future was going to be different. But they didn't leave everything, did they? They actually got to the Pacific Ocean. Almost froze, almost starved. They discovered the first grizzly bear that had ever been seen by an American, someone from the United States. On another day, they shot one and didn't kill it. That was a mistake. And Lewis ended up a tree with a wounded grizzly bear at the bottom. So there was some learning. But I'm going to come back a bit later on, if you haven't hit play again, and look at how does what they learned apply to we're not just saying they learned it so it's true, it's can we find this in Scripture? Is this biblical? Does God do radically different things in the future than the past? So that's what we're going to look at. So the conundrum is like a problem that seems to have good and bad on both sides of it. The conundrum we have is that in Isaiah 43, God says this, Forget the former things. Don't dwell on the past. I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Don't you understand it? Don't you perceive it? I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. We're actually going to come to the setting of that in a few weeks' time and unpack that even deeper. But God says to his people, I'm doing something new. Stop hanging on to the things of the past. So, the conundrum is, does God change? Can God do a new thing? It's not a simple question, is it? Because, well, what do you reckon? Just some feedback. Can God change?
Yes.
He has to. And yet, part of the most precious thing that we have is the unchanging nature of God. So, for some of you, you will know this old hymn that says, "Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning or changing with thee. Thou changest not, your compassions or thy compassions they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever wilt be." So, should we ditch this hymn? Sorry, someone, don't start a fight that I've got to finish, all right? But we're wrestling sometimes to express one truth about God. We over-present it, and if you look just at this hymn, you would go, God doesn't change. Thou changest not. And you just told me that he does change. So who's right? Are you better than a hymn writer? Come on. That's a pretty big call, isn't it?
But if he wants to change things, he can.
He
He
can.
has the power to.
That's right. He has the power, and so we're caught with this. He has the power, and we can even see evidence of it, can't we? That he changes sometimes, but the very thing that gives us confidence is he's reliable. He's faithful. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Yeah. So, I'll give you my answer. You don't have to accept it, but it helps me not go into a meltdown. Okay? And my answer is that God's nature never changes. He could, he's God, but he doesn't. His nature, his love, his eternal attributes, his wisdom, his care, his faithfulness, his justice, they never change. But his methods and what he does do change. And holding those things in tension is an important thing. Let me go back to Lewis and Clark. They left their canoes behind, but they didn't strip naked, give up all their money and their provisions and walk into the Rocky Mountains. They sat there and they said, which is essential for us to keep and not lose as we go into this incredibly new frontier? What will we need? And what can we change? And in their case, they decided that canoes were methodology. But they kept a lot of other stuff, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So here's the question that I want to put to you. So you can do some of my work for me. I wanted you to think of some examples from the Bible where the future was going to be radically different from the past. That's what we have at Lemhi Pass. We have the end of the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains, very, very different landscapes, and they had to wrestle with that. So in the Bible, were there times that come to your thoughts where the people of God were faced with the same thing? We've said, or I've suggested, that God's nature doesn't change, but the circumstances do, and they're responsive. So, any ideas? Pretty happy that Christ's resurrection, that was a new one for the books, wasn't it? Yeah, very much so, yeah. The Exodus, yeah. They changed to being wandering. I don't know what they did, but I'll guarantee they didn't continue to be brick makers. That's not a good thing when you're camping. Yeah, Greg.
This saying it's strange, but the stoning of Stephen brought about the church in Jerusalem being kicked out.
Yep.
Actually, into Mediterranean.
Yeah. Kick-started the persecution of the early church. Yeah.
The fall of Adam and Eve.
The fall of Adam and Eve, yeah, that changed things a fair bit. Oh, yeah. It's easy for us to say, isn't it? Yeah. Peter and Cornelius, where suddenly the message of God's love was not to a single nation, but it was breaking those. Yeah, Don. Noah's flood, guaranteed, absolutely. I'm not going to look at all of those, but I certainly, and you picked up a number of them. The Exodus we're going to have a look at that in the future, in the weeks to come, and say how different was it when people who were slaves were set free? They were self-governing, and they were brick makers, and they suddenly became wandering, nomadic people, and all this kind of stuff. So that was radically different. The future was going to be very different. I want to suggest that the exile, where they went from being a people with their own king, they were conquered by the Babylonians and relocated hundreds, I'm not even sure, it could be thousands of kilometres away from their land and their temple and everything they knew. I want to say that was a major reorientation. Then just when they got used to that, God said, I'm going to take you back. And he said it to everyone and said, well, we don't know what back looks like. We weren't alive when everyone else left. We're comfortable here. My veggies are just about to produce and, kind of, I've got a savings account and a nice house and I've just had it renovated and they were happy to stay in exile. God says, no, I've got a different way for you. And as Greg alluded to, the persecution of the early church. So we're going to have a look at those in the weeks ahead and ask the question of what can we learn for the future ahead of us that we can learn from these people. Let me just take a slight detour, well not detour, but when I think, I look back and ask these questions of myself. The world has changed, we know this. And so to expect the same results in a different environment can be quite challenging. When I was part of youth group and leading youth work, if you put on a film, and it used to come as a roll on a projector that you fed through and stuff like, just like you see in MASH, that was the best entertainment for any kid in the town on that day. There weren't mobile phones, there weren't DVDs, there weren't video cassettes. And within a few years, we were competing with all of those things. And it was radically different. All of a sudden, to be the best thing on offer on a Friday night was a lot harder than when I was growing up. To be a Christian or to live a different life in some ways was a bit different. Can any of you remember a time where there was no late night shopping? You remember a time when banks were only open 5 days a week, and for them they chose the most inconvenient time for anyone and said that's not going to work. 10 till 3 in the afternoon, can't get there before work, can't get there after work. Shops generally shut at midday on Saturday, didn't they? And virtually nothing, there were no 24-hour service stations, there were no, and I'm not saying this is a better time, I'm just saying it's a different time. Getting people to, and again, church was one of the better things on offer for people on a Sunday. You couldn't go to the shops, you couldn't, no restaurants were open, you couldn't buy petrol, maybe there would be one ungodly service station in a town that opened on a Sunday. But when I grew up, that was pretty rare. You could get a paper for about 2 hours on a Sunday morning, then it shut down. There wasn't gender equality. The first job I ever got was I was a paper boy. That's not a politically incorrect way of terming it. Every paper boy was a boy. I'm probably not allowed to say that now. But, the reality was that most women in church were stay-at-home mums. That's what I grew up in. So ladies groups and play groups were abounding with young women who were fit volunteers raising their kids. That's no longer the case. There are so many things that have changed. And you know what? Most people go, what kind of church do you belong to? And the first thing you'll do is you'll tell them how many people are here on a Sunday morning. Because that's the way we used to measure it all those years ago. But the reality is, the families that youth are connecting with, they're not generally wondering how can they fill in an empty Sunday morning, are they? And they're probably not going, my life is so boring that I think I'd really like to meet with a group of people I don't know and sing songs that I've never heard before. That's a pretty big ask. But at the same time, I want to say we can be a really healthy church without seeing this congregation grow numerically. We can have an awesome youth ministry, and we do have an awesome youth ministry. It's the envy of so many other churches, 2 and 3 times our size. But we've got to realise that the days of saying how good is a church no longer should be measured by a Sunday morning attendance. It's a great thing. Don't get worried. I'm not going to stop Sunday morning because I love it. And it works really well for people. It's a great discipleship, and that's what we're about. But it's not a great model for everyone. So we've got to have different ways, or additional ways of saying we're doing the right thing. One of the things that Lewis and Clark did, here's some lessons. I'm going to tell you that that's not a picture, by the way, just if you're confused by what the technology does. That's a painting. They had to determine the future about the truth about the future. They stood there, they looked at the Rocky Mountains and said, let's go horses. Let's go horses. They also could have decided to go back. And the second thing they did was gain a clear understanding of what their purpose was. Remember, they had 4 things. The top one was find a seaway, a river, a waterway to the west coast. And they're looking at that and going, failed. That doesn't count. But they were also to trade with the Indians, and they said, we can still do that. They were also to establish US authority and let people know who had bought and who they'd be working with, and that other people would know. They could still do that. And the call of discovery, as they were called, realised they had a call on their life bigger, because they were to write down that they saw a grizzly bear and all the different birds. And the journals are amazing. Every single day, 2 or 3 people wrote detailed journals of everything they saw and did, every problem and every joy they had. And they got a clear understanding of what our purpose is. We are meant to discover what this new land is like. We can still do that. And churches need to go back and go, what are we called to do? And we're called to make disciples. And the methods don't matter that much, in one sense. They need to decide what needs to be kept and what we let go of. That's a really crucial thing, isn't it? Because they sat there and they said, we're going to let go of the canoes, but we better keep the guns and the gunpowder and the trading goods and the food. And they said, we can let go of this, but we can never let go of that. And that's what churches need to do. And I think the biblical people, the people of Israel, needed to do every occasion. When we go into exile, when we go into the Exodus, what can we leave behind that's just going to be too heavy to carry, but what do we need to take with us? And we'll explore those things. And for us as a church, we read that passage where Paul said the Jews, they wanted miraculous signs, and the Greeks, they wanted deep wisdom. And he said, and we decided we wouldn't give them what they wanted, we would give them what cannot change. We would preach Christ crucified. They said we can, no matter what people want, the message of the gospel is eternal. Later on in the same book, Paul said, my words, the way you deliver the gospel is incredibly adaptive. You can do it in lots of different ways. To the weak I became weak. To the slave I became I became all things to all men so that by all means I could win some. Here's Paul who has wrestled with, you cannot give up this. But the way you deliver it can be as creative as you want. That's the world we live in. That's the world we face. Commit to learning new skills. Do you know who the experts were in this new land? Who do you think? For Lewis and Clark. Sorry? The natives. And I think one of the things we have to do, and we'll have to increasingly do, not just us, but the church, is listen to the people we're trying to reach and learn from them rather than come with a paternalistic, we've been doing this for 2,000 years as a church, we have a product that we want to sell to you even though you don't know you need it, you don't know you want it. Sometimes better than us fronting someone and say, hey, guess what? We have the answer to your life. Maybe the first place is tell me about your life. What's life like for you guys? Where are you struggling? What can we celebrate with? And in that, we discover that Jesus Christ is still the answer. Still the answer. So, that's the introduction. The journey ahead for us is we will look and we will learn, not from Lewis and Clark, that's a nice snapshot. We will learn from Scripture. What did they learn about the future in the exile? What did they learn in the early church when it seemed like surely not? I guess they probably had people who were praying spiritual warfare prayers against the evil that was happening to them. God's up there going, yeah, but what an opportunity. I am trained, I am equipped, I am good at canoeing. And I'm faced with a set of Rocky Mountains. I probably think that I'm one of the last generation of paid professional full-time clergy. Churches are getting larger, bigger and more complex and much smaller, simple and adaptable. And what we know is very, very different. So I want us to re-ask some questions in the months ahead. What is the great stuff that will never change that we're meant to keep? How can we be adaptive? How can we expect the results and successes in the future to be measured slightly differently from the past? That's not an easy thing to do. Let's ask God's help in that. Heavenly Father, it seems like we're agreed that you are eternal in your character and nature, unchanging, dependable, and your methodologies can be frighteningly changeable. Just when we get the hang of doing one thing, you seem to call us to do another. But you never call us into a landscape, into a kind of an area that you don't enable us to do your will in, to be successful in your terms. I pray as we open this year that we will look and see that combination of opportunities that are new and fresh and sometimes scary, and the things that we have treasured that you're saying never let go of that. May we learn from your word, may we learn from each other, and may we learn from the people who are out there who know how to do this. And we pray that in Jesus' name.